Hey, what's up, y'all? My name is Millennial Smark, and I'm bringing you the slop, the whole slop, and nothing but the slop. This is so cringe. This is so cringe. Look, like I said, when it comes to the tribalism, I have fun with it. I don't mind it. This is the type of slop that I like to see when it comes to the tribalism. Seeing people on the AEW side instantly turn on Chris Jericho, and seeing people on the WWE side instantly welcome Chris Jericho back. It's just so cringe, man. It's cringe, but I like to see it. You love to see it. You love to see it. Look at this shit right here. Look at this. AEW has been infinitely better without Jericho stinking up every pay-per-view card. He was one of the most important signings in AEW's history, but he's been actively hurting the product these past few years. Truly hope he's done. Smuh. Oh, this is from JD. Nobody hated Chris Jericho. We hated the terrible television he was allowed to create because Tony Khan can't say no. Let's see. This is another tweet. Get fucked, Chris Jericho, you old, out of shape. I'll never go back to WWE. Has been piece of MAGA loving shit eating bastard. Fuck him. Holy shit. Did he fuck your mom? Who? Let me see. Who is this? Oh, okay. One of those LGBT. I am empathetic. I am the most empathetic person in the world. I have an LGBT flag in my profile. I have Caesar, they, them. Inside of my handle, I am the best. Yeah, we get it, bro. We get it. So, because I love all these comments, but we have to get to the actual topic at hand. Apparently, Chris Jericho liked a post on Instagram, I believe, essentially hinting at the fact that his contract is ending later on this year, and there's a chance that he might end up in WWE. Now, as we've been seeing with Jericho as of these past few years, his work has not been good at all. But I feel like it's, mind you, you're talking to me. I like to think that I'm like the number one Jerichoholic in the fucking world. I am Jericho's biggest stan. I am Chris Jericho's biggest fan. I love me some Chris Jericho. I've been a Jericho mark all my life. Jericho is the reason why I'm here even talking to you guys. I am number one Jericho stan. Numero uno. Me, Ichiban. All right? So I can sit here and I can actually be a qualified person to talk about this. Qualified to talk. Okay, sorry, laughing at my own jokes is not based. But I'm one of those people that have been actively talking about Chris Jericho needing to retire. You know, you see his work in AEW, and it's not just the work in itself, because I think people are focusing too much on his actual in-ring stuff, which is profoundly retarded, because there's more to wrestling than just the in-ring component, as we've been touching on for the better part of half a decade here on this channel. It's also his work on the microphone, right? You know, you hear Jericho talk, and he's still decent, you know. You can never not be an astute promo guy, or never not be an astute promo guy when you were already very good at it, right? And you could diminish in regards to your athleticism by getting older, but your promos, if you're just naturally charismatic and you're naturally good, you got the quintessential gift of the gab, right? You're always gonna be on point. But even then, I still kind of feel like, even though Jericho is decent on the microphone nowadays, it's not the same Chris Jericho from back in the days, right? When was the last time you heard Jericho call someone an ass clown, right? Like, when was the last time you heard of any of Jericho's catchphrases or any of that stuff? And I know Jericho typically likes to evolve. He doesn't like to stand in one spot and just stare at people, you know, going by him and everything like that. But there does reach a point sometimes when you see Jericho's work nowadays, and it kind of makes you look at him and go, man, you are a shell of your former self. This is not the Chris Jericho I grew up on. This is not the same Chris Jericho. And I feel like people discussing Chris Jericho at the moment and alluding to the fact that he could return to WWE, do you naturally want to see that? Do you necessarily care to want to see that? Now, I know people say age ain't nothing but a number, but goddamn, it's a little bit further when it comes to Chris Jericho. He'll be 55 in November. You guys realize that, right? He'll be 55 in November. Jericho is old. Jericho is beyond past his prime. I'll be quite frank with you. Jericho hasn't been the same performer since like 2010. And honestly, from 2007 to 2010, I don't want to say his work was his work was terrible, because it absolutely was. And I thought Jericho had a stellar 2008 and 2009. But I do say, in comparison to where he was at back in like the cruiserweight days, or, his ambition and his drive to grow and be a star performer in the early 2000s by making himself stand out a little bit more, even that wasn't to the degree. He still had great work, obviously, with Shawn Michaels and people like Rey Mysterio, for an example. Still excellent work in 2008 and 2009. But even that, compared to what he was doing in the early 2000s and throughout the 90s, wasn't quite the same. So only imagine how it was from 2012 when he returned and he was doing the cringe, I come out and I smile and I say no words and I leave again gimmick. Remember that? Now, take that, Jericho, because even then he was somewhat decent. When you look at the matches with Punk, for an example, you look at the matches with Dolph Ziggler, and then you get to Fandango Jericho in 2013, and then you get to Wyatt Jericho in 2014 or 2015, and then you get to the fucking, Jericho. At least he was fun then. That's what I mean about the diminished return on Chris Jericho when it comes to athleticism. Because even though his athleticism drastically went down as the years started to go on, he was still a character. He was still funny. He was still engaging. You look at the work that he was doing, obviously, with the list of Jericho and the stuff with Kevin Owens, and you're gonna get it in the Drink It In, man. Even that shit was entertaining, and he could pull out some great segments, like the stuff that he was doing with Kevin Owens in 2017. Obviously, you automatically go to the Festival of Jericho, one of the greatest segments of all time, in my opinion. And none of that stuff I feel like Jericho can do again, especially in a WWE that isn't ran by Vince McMahon. See, I think people need to understand also, it's not just the quality of Jericho's work that has declined over the past few decades, which, again, it's going to come with time. It's not just the athleticism with age, but it's also the content in regards that he wants to put out in comparison to the younger generation and what they like nowadays. I feel like it doesn't hit as hard as it did back then. Most of the younger generation will probably look at Jericho as a boomer, right? But nevertheless, though, also take into context that Jericho is returning to a WWE ran by Triple H. Now, they've always had a rocky relationship, right? They've always been the, would I even say best of friends? I can't even say that. On good terms, let's say that. Because I was going to try to maybe make an argument that Jericho and Triple H were friends when he interviewed him a couple of years ago, but even then I kind of felt a little bit of tension there also. Not to mention, I can't remember verbatim what Jericho said, but he went on one of these shoots, these live shoots in England, if I'm not mistaken, and he buried Triple H not too long after that interview anyway, so it's like I don't think he gave a shit regardless. But Triple H and Jericho, for the most part, not always, not sure of their relationship nowadays, but they've never been the best of friends, right? Now, you may look at CM Punk and Triple H's relationship, but at least with CM Punk, he has something to give Triple H, right? Triple H doesn't have to like CM Punk to at least see the opportunities given to him by a CM Punk in terms of his popularity, in terms of how over he is, the merchandise that you can get out of it. CM Punk is still relevant to this audience. Not to say that Chris Jericho is irrelevant, but he's not as relevant as CM Punk. And this is coming from a diehard Jerichoholic, right? Overall, with the new audience, with the current audience, not overall in professional wrestling. Jericho is not quite as hyped as CM Punk is right now. So what is the incentive to want to work with your enemy? Or maybe I shouldn't say enemy to that degree, because again, I'm not sure of the relationship of Jericho or Triple H, but historically, two guys who didn't like each other all too much. It's always been the thing with Triple H, as far as hearing how everybody talks about it, that Triple H kind of had a thing for Jericho as far as maybe just a tad bit jealousy. Like the long hair guy who's muscular, who's athletic, who can do this and do that, and here you have Triple H, who is, dominant in his own right, but he's not quite Jericho when it comes to the in-ring caliber stuff, right? Back then, at least, or even now, obviously. Is there animosity there? If I remember correctly, in 2017, speaking of the Festival of Friendship stuff, there were button heads right there, too. Jericho was like on a branch. He was really going hard to push that segment, and Triple H actively was going out of his way to dismiss it. Triple H was going actively out of his way to get rid of the segment. Jericho had to go above Triple H's head and get it confirmed through Vince McMahon. Now, I will say Triple H eventually seen the segment and he thought it was a great idea. But it's just to show you the animosity that's lingering there with Chris Jericho and Triple H. And it is something that should be questioned and talked about a little bit more thoroughly, that I'm pretty sure has drifted in and out of Jericho's mind if this return is actually going to be a thing going forward. Do you really want to deal with a WWE ran by Triple H? Do you really want to deal with a WWE looking at talent that you want to work with and push forward, knowing that there's a good shot that Triple H might not want to deal with that talent? And how are you going to feel about watching Triple H do to the talent that you would not want them to, that you would not want happening to that talent, right? Jericho's he's very headstrong, right? He's very strong-minded. All the Canadians are, right? How is Jericho going to feel about that? You know, I look at this whole scenario, and if you want my honest opinion when it comes to this, I think Jericho should absolutely return to WWE, right? That's his home, not AEW. I always thought it was a weird move that he went to AEW. I got it. I understood, you know, from Jericho's personal bank account. I can understand, obviously, you know what I mean? Like, you want to be able to make as much money as you can applying your trade. I completely get it. Jericho's a big name. Jericho's a household name for the most part. Not as big as some talents, but big enough to be considered somewhat of a household name, or about as close to a household name as you could possibly get. You know what I mean? So it's like, I get it. You were a star. You were a reason for Tony Khan to want to put a title on, because you were the closest person as far as a full-time wrestler who was commercial within the company. All that I completely understand. But he never was necessarily what I would consider a good fit. And honestly, something else that I feel like should be relevant in the discussions in regards to Triple H and Jericho's relationship is, I'm pretty sure, especially with the producers who probably would go up to Triple H and let him know, I'm pretty sure Triple H is well aware that some of the ideas that were going down in AEW, or the influence of AEW, was pretty much guided by Chris Jericho at times. And it's not lost on me for Triple H to probably look at some of the ideas that Jericho did at that time and probably hear Jericho say something now and laugh at him. It wouldn't be the first time Triple H laughed at Chris Jericho directly in front of his face, but this time he's in a position of power. You know, this whole AEW run with Chris Jericho, if you were to ask me whether or not it was a success or a failure, man, it's not going to be a consistent opinion, because initially it was a success for what it actually did in regards to catapulting AEW into the mainstream sphere, but it was a failure because look what Jericho did as time started to go on. Nothing. The star and the caliber and the legend of Chris Jericho being within your company, you think you would want to do more with, and you did nothing, which made Chris Jericho have to rely on some of his creative, which has been admittedly pretty fucking terrible. Once again, coming from a Jericho fan. So I also look at that. There's an incentive to bring Jericho back to WWE because it's fucking Chris Jericho, right? His name alone is always going to be an incentive. But as a performer, you know, we went throughout all these things throughout this entire video, listing off the things that Jericho has been competent at one time and no longer competent at currently at the moment. Is it smart to want to use Jericho in any capacity as a performer currently right now? I don't think so. Is it smart to use Chris Jericho in a creative sense? Well, A, no, if you look at some of his recent work in AEW, and B, even if you want to say there's a filter that you can probably filter some of Chris Jericho's ideas out, I'm not sure if Triple H is quite on that train. Maybe that could just be me. It's just the history of seeing Jericho and Triple H and the animosity, the real life animosity between the two. I just don't see it creatively, even if you were to filter some of Jericho's ideas, how that's going to work necessarily speaking. I think there's way too many egos going on with that. I'm thinking I would not be shocked if Jericho showed up, and within the next year, mark my words, if Jericho returns to WWE, say in December or November, I wouldn't be shocked if all it took is a couple of months before Jericho and Triple H started butting heads. I truly think that's going to be the case. I think if Jericho returns to WWE right now, him and Triple H are going to fucking butt heads. It's inevitable. These two don't like each other and they both have huge egos. I'm not too sure how Jericho's going to be cool with Triple H being his boss, his direct boss. We're not talking about a guy hanging off of Vince McMahon's arms and Jericho can go over Triple H's head and talk to Vince like he did in 2017. No, this is his boss. The same guy who was in the locker room with you is now your boss. Like, how would you guys feel about that? Like, say for an example, you left the company at a somewhat high position, and right next to you in that high position was a guy that you didn't quite like all too well. But you guys did business, you did what needed to be done to, push forward in your job, right? And then you leave, and then you come back, and that guy that you didn't like is now your boss? Personally, Jericho should just come back and be an ambassador for the company. If you ask me, that's what I think. I think he should be an ambassador for the company. I think Jericho, which ironically enough, I always find this funny when it comes to wrestlers. Jericho fucking hates Triple H, but he fucking loves Shawn Michaels. Him and Shawn Michaels are good friends in real life. I always find that to be funny. That happens a lot with most wrestlers. I think Jericho working hand to hand with Shawn Michaels in NXT should be something that should be looked into. I think Jericho actually performing in NXT would be a better result. You know what I mean? Younger talent who are going to be up there and taking care of you, and at the same time, you using your presence to get them over. I think Chris Jericho in NXT working hand to hand with Shawn Michaels, being an ambassador, and maybe next year getting inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame is the path that Jericho should go down currently at the moment. There should be no need for Jericho to be a full-time performer in any capacity in WWE right now. There shouldn't be. I remember when I was a kid, and I used to hate seeing all the 80s guys come back and take up the spotlight. Now I'm older and I understand wrestling a little bit more, and I'm such a fucking wrestling nut job when it comes to history, so obviously now I don't mind, and even up to like the last 20 years I didn't mind. But as a kid, 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, I didn't like watching the legends come back. I didn't like watching them take a spot. I used to walk away from Hacksaw Jim Duggan matches. You know what I mean? The only reason I cared for them, if for anything else, if they were in a segment with Randy Orton taking an RKO. You know what I mean? Because he's the legend killer. I can only imagine, how much of a hypocrite I'd be to sit back and, I'm pretty sure some of the younger guys and, the wrestling in the social circles within wrestling today, the IWC, the whole entire community. I know these people nowadays want to see the Seth Rollins and, the newer guys, the Will Ospreays of the world. I know that's what you guys want to see. And I know at the same time, you don't want to see Jericho back. At least not in the capacity to want to watch him wrestle full time, especially knowing the extent of what he brings to the table, which is not much nowadays. It is what it is. Bring him back as an ambassador. Bring him back as a trainee, if you will. Bring him back as a coordinator. Bring him back as an assistant, deputy role to Shawn Michaels. Do that. But full-time competition Jericho on the main roster? Fuck no. Absolutely not. But let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below in regards to how you feel about the entire commentary. How do you feel about AEW fans and WWE fans going back and forth about Chris Jericho, but now it's vice versa compared to where it was a couple of years ago when Jericho was on AEW and not on WWE? How do you feel about what I was bringing up in regards to Jericho and how fit is he to actually have a run on the main roster if that's the path that they were going to go down? How do you feel about the relationship between Triple H and Chris Jericho to even suggest that's the path that they should also go down if Jericho wants to come back to WWE? How do you feel about his work and his run in AEW and what's his lasting legacy in AEW? And more importantly, what do you think Jericho should do if he's going to come back to WWE? I'm very curious as to whether or not I'm the only person who's taken into consideration all of these things before Jericho comes back. And once again, you're coming from a hardcore Jerichoholic, so if I can criticize him and bring up the positives and the negatives, surely some of you tribalists out there can look past the fact as to whether or not he's a WWE guy and whether or not anything that we're talking about is relevant. Can we do that? Probably not. But as always, my name is Devontae, aka Millennial Smark, and I'll be catching you fine folks later. A deuces and a P. Eyes.